I know, I've made these mistakes too. Hi and welcome to Knit with Hannah. I'm Hannah, I'm here with Knitting Natter to help you knit with ease, confidence and joy. Let's talk some farewell knitting today. I have 7 tips for you to really think about before you start knitting farewell. And basically it's knitting with 2 colours at once. So it means that you're going to hold 2 colours of yarn separately and use them together with these stitches as you move across the row. These farewell tips are the kind of things that I wish I'd recognised in my own knitting before I started farewell, because there were things that just caught me and made it more difficult and tougher than I wished it would be. I got frustrated when I made mistakes because I didn't realise that any old knitter might also make mistakes. I'd been knitting for 25 years at that point and I thought, oh, I'm good enough, I can do farewell, and I made it too complicated. You'll learn a lot and you'll really get some great results at the end of it once you've done some farewell knitting. I have 4 tips for you for the knitting skills that you'll need and 3 tips for you about the yarn that you'll be using. So hang on for all of those tips. It can be really helpful to have these in your head before you begin farewell knitting. The first one may seem really obvious, but make sure you are comfortable with knit stitches and purl stitches. Knitting farewell is usually done on stocking stitch, and that means knitting 1 row, purling 1 row, knitting 1 row, purling 1 row. I will talk about an alternative just further along in these tips, but let's just discuss this one first. You need to be able to tell the difference between them. When you pick up your knitting, which is next? Is it a knit row or a purl row? You need to be comfortable moving between them. You need to be able to work across a knit row and a purl row with a steady, comfortable rhythm. As you venture into this farewell knitting, it's best that you can focus on the farewell knitting colour chart and not try and figure out what stitch is next and how you make a knit stitch or a purl stitch. Getting those ingrained in your knitting mind when you pick up your knitting can be really, really helpful. So my second tip is, how about learning to unpick stitches one at a time? This is not predictably always going to happen, but if you're a beginner and you're following a colour chart, it may well happen that you will need to unpick a few stitches or even a whole row. So it's really helpful to have that in your knitting toolkit as well. Just know that you can fix mistakes by unpicking 1 stitch at a time. There is a video here on my channel about unpicking your knitting 1 stitch at a time. It's quite a recent one as well, so do go and have a look at that. I'll leave the link to that video in the description below. The third tip is about keeping track of the stitches on your needles. Are you able to look at your knitting as you're moving along the needles, as you're moving along the row, and say that stitch is out of place or that stitch shouldn't be there? If you are knitting with 2 colours, it's a slight chance that you will end up with a strand of yarn that's supposed to be hidden actually on the needle as well. Just be aware of those stitches, take your time, and as you're knitting with 2 colours, just knit a little bit more slowly and be aware of this problem that might occur. It's not going to happen every time you knit with 2 colours, but it's a possibility. So just being aware of that and being able to say, yes, this is right, yes, no, that's wrong, and being able to fix it, it will mean that you won't have to unpick your knitting once you've gone along the row and taken a look at it once you've finished that row. I know, I've made these mistakes too, and I've had to unpick, say, 1.5 rows because I made that mistake. And it can just be a pain. Just take that little bit more time when you're knitting with 2 colours. Now, this is the one that I mentioned earlier. If you already do circular knitting, which means that you knit in the round, and that means that you are very likely to be knitting every single stitch. This can be really helpful if you want to knit in the round when you first do farewell knitting. It will mean that you won't have to be doing the purl row in between the knit row. If you would like to do this, then it is an option. Finding farewell patterns that work in the round to start with, and simple farewell patterns that work in the round to start with, can be a really good choice if you already have those skills and you'd like to take that option. When I started knitting farewell, I actually wanted to learn knit and purl stitches in farewell. There's nothing wrong with starting farewell knitting in the round on circular needles. we all make our own choices. That was just my choice. And this is what I'll be teaching, the knit stitch and the purl stitch in ferrule knitting next week in the tutorial, and of course in the knit along as well. There's just one other thing I wanted to mention, and this is a bonus tip that I completely forgot to mention when I was filming the main video. However, this is the Ladybird book of crochet. I used this book in my teens to learn how to crochet. And the brilliant thing about this is that it teaches you how to hold the work. If I hadn't learnt this method when I was a teenager, I wouldn't have been willing to start ferrule knitting. If you've never done crochet before, do not worry. It's not an absolute must, but I must say it really did help me. Okay, let's move on to yarn tips for ferrule knitting. The first one is something that I've mentioned before in other videos, and I find it something that I didn't really understand when I was starting to ferrule knit, but it's really helped me as I've done it more, and that is knitting with plied yarns. The better quality yarns as well. This means that the yarn is likely to be more bouncy. You're going to have the stretch in the yarn, and also that means that it's elastic so that it will shrink and release as well. And then the strands at the back of your ferrule knitting will actually sit more comfortably. They won't be too tight if you're careful when you're knitting, and neither will they be too loose. They will stretch and release. The cotton yarn that we're using for the baby hats in the knit along, I've chosen on purpose so that it is stretchy and bouncy enough so that it works well with the ferrule knitting style. The next yarn tip for ferrule knitting is to start not with a very, very thin yarn, a sock yarn and a really small needle. You need to be able to see the stitches, hold the yarn comfortably, and even if you are a sock knitter and you're used to knitting with thin yarn and small needles, I would suggest moving over to use maybe a medium weight yarn, such as a DK as we are for the knit along, but also how about an aran or worsted yarn with a 5 or a 5.5 millimeter needle. This is the kind of yarn that I've even just tested ferrule patterns with, and this is how I started ferrule knitting too. So just be willing to stretch that bit, make some placemats or some bookmarks or even a scarf with ferrule knitting. Give yourself that time to practice, to just have an experiment, and you will learn a lot more by doing that with a thicker yarn than trying to do a really intricate pattern on a thinner yarn and thinner needle. Right, my third yarn tip, which might seem very obvious because we don't see it any much differently very often, and that is to pick contrasting colours to start when you are knitting ferrule. And there's two parts to this. First of all, plain colours. If you're knitting with, say, two different multicolour yarns, so they're both striping, then you don't know where you are and you don't know which yarn you're using. Even if one of them is multicoloured and it's striping through different colours, you may get stuck on which yarn is doing what in the colour chart as you're knitting through it. Then there's also the point where you don't only use plain colours, but you use plain colours that are separate to each other, that feel like a lot more of a contrast than you might otherwise use. For example, here we have a plaster pink and a pear green. These are quite close to each other, and the best way to do this is to actually look at them sat next to each other, even when they're still wound up into balls of yarn, and take a photograph and change it to black and white, and you will see whether or not these colours are contrasting very much. That will mean whether or not it will be seen once you've finished. You can easily tell these apart when you're actually knitting, but will the effect show? I wanted this to be a very subtle effect. So this is the one which doesn't have a big dramatic effect when it's finished. The other colours of ferrule baby hats that we're doing have quite a good contrast. There's a darker yellow and a bright white. That's a very dark sailor blue and a denim blue. It's easier to knit with, and for example, if you were knitting with black and white, you would definitely know which yarn you were knitting with. So do take those tips into consideration when it comes to yarn. Knit with a plied yarn, start with a thicker yarn, and practice as well with that thicker yarn before you dive into a project that you feel is really important to you and may even have a more intricate pattern. And then pick your contrasting plain colours to start with. Most of all, know that as a beginner in everything, there will be mistakes. There will be times when you actually say, you know what, I'm going to unravel this whole thing and start over. When I was knitting these hats, I made such a mistake on this one, and I've done feral knitting before. I just did it when I was tired and I wasn't focusing that well, and I just had to say, okay, I'm unraveling it. And I went back down to 4 rows and I started the feral knitting again. It meant that I didn't put a massive pressure on myself to say this has to be right first time, and I would really suggest the same thing for you. This knitting kit for the baby hat trio is now available. There's the stripy hats as well as this feral, and of course there's absolutely no pressure to definitely do the feral hat. You get the 3 balls of yarn, you get the patterns, so you can choose the 2 stripy yarns, and indeed you can knit a plain baby hat as well. Thank you so much for joining me today. I will see you again soon. All of the links to what I've talked about today are in the description below. I will leave the link here for the plied yarns tutorial. What are plies? Why are they important? And do hit subscribe, of course, right there. And if you're subscribed, YouTube will let you know when the next video is available. Right, bye for now. Happy knitting.